Well, good evening to anyone who's just tuning in. This is the Top Talk Net on the Freestyle Network. Good evening. We're connected all over the world via analogue and digital, so thanks for joining us this evening. Our special guest is Peter Waters G3OJV, and he's got some interesting stuff to tell us this evening.
Well, welcome to the Waters and Stanton video channel again. That was about a week ago. I was asked to talk on that event there, and there was quite a few hands from all over the world. I mean, I'll just play you a few of the excerpts here, or at least the call signs anyway, and you can hear them. Put the mixer on.
Good evening to England. This is Kilo 6, Foxtrot, Zebra, Unicorn.
And GTH is Kirkcaldy.
So this is Whiskey 8, Juliet Mike India.
This is Oscar Zulu 1, Mike Alpha Romeo.
Well, there we are. A few of the hams that actually called in. And it was an interesting question I was asked to start off with. How did I get into ham radio and how long have I been licensed? And it actually, the conversation went on and it triggered something that prompted me to put the heading at the beginning of this video, which I'll come on to in a minute.
So I'll kick off with the first question I think we'd like to know is, how did you get started in radio, Peter? And how long have you been licensed?
Well, thanks very much for that question. I'll answer the second part first of all. I was actually licensed in 1960. That means I've held my ham radio license for 61 years. My goodness, how time flies. But yeah, that's true. I've held my ham radio license for 61 years and I've seen a lot of changes, I can tell you that. But how did I get involved in amateur radio? Well, I suppose I was always a little bit interested in electronics. And it was, I think I was 15 years at the time, and I walked into the local newsagents and I saw a copy of Shortwave magazine. Now, I didn't know much about radio, but I did know that shortwave was to do with radio. And I flicked through it and it seemed quite interesting. I saw a picture of a man in front of a lot of radio equipment. And so I bought this copy, took it home and read it from cover to cover. And I was interested to find out that you can actually run your own radio station. That seemed to be fascinating. I also found out that you needed to pass the City and Guilds examination and a Morse test of 12 words. Well, shortly after that I started work and I worked in London. So I got myself some books on radio and spent the time travelling backwards and forwards to London on the train from where I lived up to Liverpool Street, studying these radio books so that I could pass the exam. In the meantime, I also joined the local radio club, and that was really good because I was fascinated that I was mixing with real amateur radio operators, and I sort of really looked up to them and admired their skills. So anyway, I think after about a year of studying, I took my City and Guilds exam, passed that. I then had to do the Morse test, which I did in London, and that was quite easy because I worked in London. And I got the pass certificate for the Morse test, and I was within walking distance of the post office where they issued ham radio licenses. So at lunchtime, I walked to this post office, and the lady there came to the counter, and she looked at my pass certificates and so forth. And then she opened a textbook, and I was allowed to choose any call sign on that page. And that was it. I had my license, I went home, and I didn't have a transmitter, but somebody at the local club lent me a very basic crystal controlled 160 metre transmitter, and I think I had my first QSO the following evening. So that's really how I started ham radio. The question that I was subsequently asked was a difficult one, and it's one that I've been asked before. I was asked about 2 months ago when I gave a club talk. And the question was, how do I see the future of ham radio? Well, if I had a crystal ball, maybe I would be able to give you the answer. I do have the advantage, of course, that I do see the products that are selling through. I know what products are popular and what products aren't, and which antennas are popular and so forth. So it gives me a certain amount of information about what people are doing and the trends, but by no means is it scientific. Let's go back a long way. There was a time when ham radio operators spoke to each other. And you might say, well, they're doing exactly the same today. Well, they are. But unfortunately, you're not always sure, and you don't always know what's happening. You know, in the early days of ham radio, you had 5 or 6 ham radio bands, and it was all simplex operation. You worked from A to B, and that was it. If you listened on 160 metres, you'd hear all the local stations. If you listened on 80 metres, you'd hear the sort of semi-local stations and so forth, and you'd hear the DX stations on 20 metres. So you got a fair idea of what was happening. You went down the CW end, it was full of CW signals, perhaps there was a contest on, or conditions were very good. And up on the other end, you went on the AM section, of course it was then, and you could hear all the activity. So it gave you some clue as to what the radio conditions were like. So in those early days, you got a pretty good idea of what was going on, and you had a pretty good chance of working most of your local ham radio operators. But you know, today, it's quite possible that a lot of your local ham radio colleagues, you won't work at all on the air. Let's go back again. I can remember when the first ham radio repeater came on the air, which I think was the Cambridge repeater, and that was the first ham radio repeater in the UK. And I can remember that opening up and stations piling in and wanting to work through the repeater, and it was great because it meant to say that if you were operating 2 metre mobile, this bandit was on, of course, 2 metres. If you were operating 2 metre mobile, it meant that you could work over great distances. And it was fascinating. And I can remember the access was a 1750 hertz tone, and if you were clever at whistling, you could whistle it up. And we sold in those days lots and lots of 1750 hertz tone bursts. But you know what actually happened subsequently was that there was a proliferation of repeaters popping up all over the UK. And if you actually go in now to the RSGB site and look at the local repeaters, there's so many repeaters, it's quite amazing. But you know what actually started to happen? The repeaters were cutting down the point-to-point contacts, and lots of stations, quite understandably, were using their local repeaters. So it tended to reduce the number of simplex QSOs. They were going through the repeaters. Now, because the repeaters gave great coverage and were really almost chat rooms in some respects, it meant that there was a lot of listening going on, but not so much transmitting going on. Now, I can recall, I used to go up to Norfolk quite a lot, and I used to, as I approached Norwich, or well before Norwich, I used to call through the repeater, and very often there was no reply. And what I'm relating now is not uncommon. You call through a repeater, you get no reply. You put another call out, you get no reply. And then somebody comes up in the in-group, puts out a call, and all of a sudden it's active. So you realise that you are a stranger in that sort of chat room, and there was nobody really interested in talking to you. But as soon as the mates came up on the repeater, they all had a chat. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a fact of life. That meant to say that there was less and less simplex contacts. And it gives you an example. You could be operating on the HF bands. You could be operating on 2 metres simplex. If you didn't use the repeater, you might not bump into 1 or 2 local stations that mainly operated through the repeaters. I'll give you another example. There's a station, still active actually, a very well known ham radio station. I'm not going to mention the call sign, but he used to live 5 or 6 miles away from me. And when I first came on the air, I was on 160 metres, and I knew that he existed because his call sign was quite regularly published in Radcom, in sort of band reports. But he was operating on frequencies much higher than I could even dream of operating on then. I think he was on 70 SEMS, and I mean, the idea of operating on 70 centimetres in 1960 was, well, it was beyond my capabilities in terms of building and so forth. So we never actually had a contact. And even today, I've never actually spoken to that station. Now, he lives further away now. But we did bump into each other a few years ago and had a chat over a beer, and laughing to the fact that we had never actually spoken to each other on the air because he had gone higher and higher in frequency and I'd remained in the sort of lower levels of HF and occasionally on 2 metres and very occasionally on 70 SEMS. So our paths had never crossed. Now I should explain that I'm talking about this because I'm demonstrating how difficult it is to foresee the future of ham radio, because you don't always know what your fellow ham operators are doing. In recent times we've had digital modes. We've had ICOM's D-Star, we've had Yaesu's Fusion. Now that means to say that if you haven't got a decode on your transceiver, if you don't have Fusion, you can't listen to the Fusion transmissions. And if you don't have D-Star, you can't listen to the D-Star transmissions. So basically those transmissions carry on. You're totally oblivious of those transmissions because you can't listen to them. Take it a stage further, we go on to FT8, which is a very popular mode at the moment. And what has actually happened is that a lot of operators have migrated to FT8, and a certain proportion of operators now proudly say that FT8 is their mode of preference. Nothing wrong with that, except that it means to say that if you're not on FT8, you might have a station 3 or 4 miles away from you that you've never bumped into, and you don't stand much chance of talking to if he's on FT8 and you're on SSB, for example. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that ham radio has got so many different modes, so many different areas of interest, that individual modes are being diluted. I'll give you an example. If you go down to the CW end of HF bands these days, you'll find it's far less crowded than it used to be, unless of course there's a contest on. But if you go down to the CW end, you'll find that there's far less activity than there used to be. And in fact, sometimes I go on 40 metres CW and I think, gosh, this is almost like listening on 2 metres. In some ways, it's utopia. There's no QRM at all. I can sort of find a space on 40 metres, put out a CQ, have a QSO with a station without too much of a problem. But it's not so much that CW is less popular, it's that other modes are more popular. So those that operated on CW, a lot of those will have migrated to FT8. Now, the reason that CW used to be popular, I've covered this before, one of the reasons anyway, is that because on CW you didn't really need to know the language of the station you were working. There are so many abbreviations on CW that you can have a rubber stamp QSO, exchange call signs, exchange names, exchange QTHs without too much of a problem and not really knowing the language. So that was one of the advantages of CW. You've got exactly the same advantage, of course, on FT8. So we have a lot of operators operating on FT8 at the moment, and the loss has been, or the gain, depending on how you view it, the gain is that you've got more space on the CW end, and exactly the same is happening on the SSB end. If you go up to the SSB part of the band on 20 metres, quite often I listened up there and I thought, gosh, there's not much on at the moment. Conditions must be pretty poor. Well, they may be poor, but they're not poor enough to stop FT8. So FT8 is sucking an awful lot of traffic from both SSB and CW. Now the problem here, of course, is that you're getting less and less opportunity to talk to a great number of stations, particularly local ones, because you're not operating on the same modes. In other words, a lot of ham radio operation is becoming hidden. And then we look at other modes which are basically PC based, like Echolink and so forth. Again, a lot of activity there, but unless you're on Echolink, you won't know it's happening. So the whole of the ham radio operation is now being diluted mode by mode by mode. And this comes full circle back to the question I was asked: how do I see the future of ham radio? I honestly don't know. Certainly the digital modes are providing an attraction. FT8 particularly, I'm not sure how many people will stay with FT8, but I have no doubt that FT8 will actually develop so you can have more of a QSO than you can at the moment. But the fact is that a lot of this activity is being hidden because you're not part of it. And the reason you're not part of it is because you can't hope to follow all these different modes. One of the things that is very fortunate at the moment for the whole amateur radio movement is that the major manufacturers are headed up by ham radio operators. ICOM is headed up by Mr. Inouye, a great amateur radio enthusiast, and it's to our benefit that ICOM is headed up by a radio amateur, because ICOM are selling a lot more commercial equipment than they are ham radio, but they haven't turned their back on ham radio. They're still coming out with sort of leading edge radios, the 7300, the 7610, the 9700 and so forth. Same with Yaesu. Yaesu is headed up by a ham radio operator. They've come out with the FTDX 101 and the FTDX 10. So we're fortunate there. Ellicraft, again headed up by amateur radio operators, coming out with cutting edge equipment. So we are indeed fortunate that the manufacturers of ham radio equipment are headed up by ham radio operators, and the temptation would otherwise probably be, let's turn our back on ham radio and let's concentrate on the more profitable commercial market. Well, that hasn't happened, and I hope it doesn't happen. I hasten to add that when I was asked this question, I didn't go into quite so much detail because I think a lot of the listeners might have switched off, but I'm just sort of expanding on it now. I see amateur radio as being a popular hobby for many years to come. I've compared it with fishing and so forth, because we all know that you can pick up a mobile phone and talk to Australia or New Zealand or America, but it's the idea of getting down to basics, doing it with simple equipment, using the reflective layers in the air to reflect our signals and so forth, or exploring technology, exploring these various digital modes that enable us to communicate using very weak signals. EME is another example and so forth. So I think amateur radio has a lot to offer, and I think it will continue to be popular. The one thing I can't predict is what direction it's going to go. Are we going to go more and more into digital modes, or is there going to be a stabilisation where there's a certain number of people interested in digital, there's a certain number of people that are interested in analog, and the mix will remain roughly the same? I honestly don't know. But the good news is ham radio will continue, I'm sure. So there we are. As I said just now, I didn't take quite so long to answer the question. But I do appreciate you watching. Thanks for tuning into the channel. Don't forget to press the subscribe button, because that really tells us how many people are interested. Get lots of feedback from you guys. Appreciate that all over the world. It's encouraging. By the way, just before I go, been asked to take a look at the Yaesu FTDX10. We're starting to get some more supplies through now, so I've been loaned an FTDX10 to have a look at, and I'll give you a report once I've had a play with it and see how I get on with it. But that's for another video. So in the meantime, take care, keep safe. It looks as if COVID is now becoming a disease that is something that we can start to learn to live with, but a long way to go yet. In the meantime, you take care, be careful, enjoy ham radio, speak soon.